So today we are talking about Shazam, Fury of the Gods, and honestly this is one of those superhero movies that got a much more mixed reaction than people expected when it released. Some viewers enjoyed the fantasy adventure style, the family chemistry, and the lighter tone, while others felt the movie became too chaotic with all the mythology, dragons, magical creatures, and giant CGI action happening at once. But after watching it carefully, the interesting thing is that underneath all the huge fantasy spectacle, the movie is actually telling a pretty emotional story about Billy Batson trying to hold on to the only family he has ever truly had. And while the film definitely has flaws, there is still a lot going on here with the performances, the visual style, the mythology angle, and the way the movie mixes family drama with full fantasy chaos. So in this video, we are going through the entire movie step by step, talking about the story, the characters, the acting performances, the direction, the visuals, the action scenes, the music, the emotional moments, and also why the movie ended up getting such a divided reaction after release. And honestly, once you look past all the internet negativity that surrounded the film back in 2023, there is actually a pretty entertaining fantasy superhero movie hidden underneath all the chaos. So let's just get into it. When Shazam, Fury of the Gods opens, the movie wastes very little time before introducing its main conflict. The first scene takes place in Greece inside a damaged museum where two women quietly enter while workers continue restoring ancient artifacts. The atmosphere immediately feels different compared to the first film. Instead of starting with comedy, director David F. Sandberg leans more into mythology and mystery. The lighting inside the museum stays soft and dusty while the camera slowly follows the women through broken statues and cracked hallways. The scene is simple on paper, but the presentation gives it weight because the movie allows silence to sit for a few moments instead of rushing directly into action. These women turn out to be Hespera and Calypso, played by Helen Mirren and Lucy Liu. One thing that helps the movie early on is that both actresses take their roles seriously. Helen Mirren especially brings calm authority to Hespera. She speaks slowly and carries herself like someone who has existed for centuries. Lucy Liu approaches Calypso with more aggression and impatience, which creates a good contrast between the sisters. Even during basic dialogue scenes, Liu keeps a sharp edge in her expressions that makes the character feel unpredictable. The sisters recover the broken wizard staff from the museum, and this is where the movie first shows its larger visual scale. Pieces of the staff begin floating together while magical energy glows through the room. The visual effects look polished here because the filmmakers avoid making the scene overly chaotic. The glowing effects remain clear and controlled instead of turning into random CGI explosions. The background score also starts becoming more noticeable during this sequence. Composer Christoph Beck gives the scene a mythological tone with deeper orchestral music rather than loud superhero themes, which fits the ancient magic angle the movie is pushing. After this opening, the film cuts back to Philadelphia where Billy Batson and the rest of the Foster family are now working regularly as superheroes. The transition between ancient mythology and modern city comedy could have felt awkward, but the movie keeps it flowing naturally by immediately showing how messy the family's superhero teamwork still is. They respond to a bridge collapse caused by armed criminals, and the whole rescue operation turns into controlled chaos. This bridge sequence is one of the first moments where the production budget becomes obvious. The scale is much larger than anything in the first movie. Cars hang from collapsing cables while civilians panic across multiple levels of the bridge. What actually makes the scene work is the camera placement. Even though the sequence depends heavily on CGI, the audience can still understand where characters are standing and what danger people are facing. A lot of superhero movies lose visual clarity during large action scenes, but Sandberg keeps the movement readable most of the time. The Shazam family itself continues being the heart of the movie. Zachary Levi returns as the adult superhero version of Billy, and his performance still leans heavily into excited childish energy. Some viewers felt Levi acts much younger than Asher Angel, who plays teenage Billy in his normal form, and honestly that difference is noticeable again here. Angel plays Billy as quieter and more thoughtful, while Levi behaves almost like a hyperactive kid most of the time. Even with that disconnect, Levi still handles comedic timing naturally enough that many scenes stay entertaining. The family dynamic works mainly because the cast genuinely feels comfortable together. Dylan Grazer once again becomes one of the most memorable parts of the movie as Freddie Freeman. Grazer brings nervous energy into almost every scene, but it never feels forced. He talks like an actual teenager who suddenly ended up living inside a superhero fantasy. His reactions during action scenes make situations feel more believable because he rarely acts fearless. The movie also spends more time showing Billy's fear of losing his family. Since he is close to turning 18, he worries that everyone will eventually separate and move on with their own lives. The script does not constantly stop to explain these emotions directly. Instead, little moments are spread throughout conversations where Billy keeps trying too hard to control situations or act like a leader. Asher Angel handles these quieter emotional scenes very naturally. His performance grounds the movie whenever the giant fantasy elements become too overwhelming. At home, the foster family scenes continue carrying the same warmth people liked in the first film. Darla remains energetic and talkative while Pedro stays more reserved. Eugene spends most of his time buried in technology and gaming references. The movie understands that audiences enjoy watching this family simply interact with each other casually, so some scenes are allowed to breathe without rushing toward the next action sequence. These moments help the pacing because the film already contains a huge amount of visual spectacle. One thing the movie improves visually compared to many recent superhero films is color. The costumes remain bright and easy to distinguish, magical effects glow with gold and blue lighting, and environments actually feel textured instead of looking like empty green screen stages. The Rock of Eternity especially receives much more detailed production design this time. Stairways, statues, hidden chambers, and magical symbols give the location a fantasy atmosphere that separates the movie from more science fiction-styled comic book films. Freddy's storyline slowly becomes more important once he meets a girl named and at school, played by Rachel Zegler. Their conversations feel awkward in a believable way because Freddy constantly tries acting more confident than he really is. Grazer and Zegler have relaxed chemistry together, which helps the scenes feel natural instead of overly dramatic teenage romance moments. Zegler also plays the role with enough mystery that the audience can tell something about her feels unusual long before the movie openly reveals it. Meanwhile, the Daughters of Atlas begin using the repaired staff to restore their stolen powers. The movie cuts between the sisters and the Shazam family regularly, allowing both storylines to develop side by side. Helen Mirren continues bringing a calm intelligence to Hespera while Lucy Liu pushes Calypso closer toward anger and revenge. Their scenes together actually help the pacing because the villains spend time discussing plans rather than appearing randomly just to fight. The background music becomes stronger during these mythology scenes too. Christoph Beck avoids making the soundtrack overly loud, but the deeper orchestral themes help create a sense of age and legend around the Daughters of Atlas. The movie clearly wants these villains to feel connected to ancient gods rather than ordinary comic book enemies, and the music supports that atmosphere well. Around this point, the story starts quietly building tension between Freddy's growing friendship with and the larger magical conflict happening around the city. Billy remains distracted trying to hold the family together while the Daughters of Atlas move closer toward reclaiming their power completely. So, after all the family chaos and superhero stuff from the beginning, the movie starts focusing more on Freddy. And honestly, these scenes are some of the easier parts of the film to enjoy because they feel more relaxed. Freddy is still the same guy who acts like every superhero fan suddenly got dropped inside a real comic book world. He talks too much, tries acting confident even when he clearly is not, and half the time people around him look confused by the things he says. Dylan Grazer really carries these moments naturally. It never feels like he is forcing jokes. The way he talks and reacts actually sounds like a teenager trying to hide nervousness behind humor. At school he keeps spending time with and, played by Rachel Zegler, and the movie surprisingly slows down a little here instead of rushing straight into another action scene. Their conversations feel simple and awkward in a believable way. Freddy keeps trying to impress her while also sounding completely unsure of himself. Rachel Zegler plays and very calmly. Even when she smiles or jokes around, there is still something slightly strange about her behavior, like she is always holding something back. The movie does not push that mystery too hard though. It just leaves small hints during conversations. One thing I noticed during these scenes is how different the movie feels whenever it focuses on smaller character moments instead of giant CGI fights. Director David F. Sandberg actually handles quiet scenes pretty well. The camera stays simple, the actors get room to talk naturally, and the pacing feels smoother. Sometimes superhero movies move so fast that normal conversations feel rushed, but here the film slows down enough that the characters start feeling more human again. At the same time, Billy is still dealing with his own problems inside the family. He keeps acting like the leader, but honestly half the family barely listens to him anymore. You can tell he is stressed about everyone growing older and eventually leaving the house. The movie does not stop for emotional speeches every 5 minutes, which honestly helps. Instead, you just see it in the way Billy reacts during conversations. He gets annoyed quickly whenever things go wrong, and sometimes he sounds more like an older brother trying too hard to stay in control than an actual superhero leader. Asher Angel handles those scenes pretty naturally. He keeps Billy grounded whenever the movie starts becoming too loud or goofy. Then when Billy transforms into Shazam, Zachary Levi comes in with way more energy. Honestly, the difference between the two performances is still noticeable. Levi acts much younger and sillier while Angel feels quieter and more serious. Some people liked that energy while others thought it felt inconsistent. Watching the movie, you can kind of understand both opinions. Then the movie suddenly shifts gears again when Freddy gets attacked by Hespera and Calypso at night. This whole sequence looks very different from the earlier daytime action scenes. The streets are darker, the lighting turns colder, and the movie leans more into fantasy visuals instead of superhero comedy. The daughters of Atlas finally start feeling dangerous here instead of just mysterious villains talking in dark rooms. Helen Mirren honestly fits this movie better than I expected. She never overacts the role. Hespera feels calm almost all the time, which weirdly makes her more intimidating. Then you have Lucy Liu playing Calypso with way more aggression. Every time Lucy Liu shows up, the energy changes immediately because she plays the character like someone who is constantly angry underneath the surface. During this confrontation, Freddy finally learns the truth about Anne. She reveals that she is actually Anthea, the third daughter of Atlas. The movie had already hinted at it enough earlier, so the reveal does not feel random. What makes the scene work more is Freddy's reaction. He looks genuinely confused and hurt instead of turning the moment into some giant dramatic breakdown. Rachel Zegler also keeps Anthea sympathetic. Even after the reveal, she still feels like someone stuck between two worlds rather than a straight villain. The action during this part gets pretty big visually. Cars start floating into the air, magical energy tears through the street, and buildings begin cracking apart around them. Some CGI shots definitely look better than others. A few wide destruction shots have that glossy digital look a lot of superhero movies struggle with now, but smaller details actually look good. The magical effects around the staff especially stay clear and colorful instead of becoming messy glowing nonsense. One thing I honestly appreciated was that the action stays easy to follow. A lot of big superhero movies keep cutting the camera every second until you cannot even tell what is happening anymore. Here the fights are usually shot clearly enough that you understand where everyone is standing and what the danger actually is. David Sandberg keeps the scenes controlled even when everything becomes chaotic. After the fight, Freddy loses his powers, and for the first time the family starts realizing these villains are actually a serious problem. Up until now everyone still treated superhero life almost like a game sometimes. Even during dangerous moments there was always somebody joking around. But now there is more tension inside the group because they know the daughters can actually take their powers away. Back at the Rock of Eternity, the family starts arguing about what to do next. Honestly, these scenes work mainly because the cast feels comfortable together. They really do sound like siblings talking over each other sometimes. Darla is still energetic non-stop, Eugene keeps bringing up fantasy game logic for solving problems, and Pedro mostly stays quieter in the background. The movie understands that people enjoy watching this family interact casually, so it gives them enough room to just exist together between action scenes. The Rock of Eternity itself also looks much better in this movie compared to the first one. There is way more detail now. Bigger stairways, glowing symbols everywhere, hidden rooms, giant statues. It finally feels like an ancient magical place instead of just a mostly empty CGI set. Christoph Beck's music helps a lot during these scenes too. The soundtrack has more fantasy adventure energy than typical superhero music, especially whenever the Daughters of Atlas appear. Around this point, the daughters start unleashing mythical creatures across Philadelphia, and the movie fully embraces the fantasy side of the story. Dragons, monsters, magical chaos everywhere. Some people loved how different it felt compared to normal comic book movies, while others thought the CGI overload became a little too much. Watching it now, it honestly feels like the movie trying very hard to stand out from the crowded superhero genre around that time. And while all this is happening, Billy is still trying to hold the family together while the city slowly starts falling apart around them. So once the Daughters of Atlas start spreading chaos across Philadelphia, the movie really stops feeling like a normal superhero film and turns more into a fantasy adventure with superheroes stuck in the middle of it. The city suddenly has giant creatures running around, people panicking in the streets, and magical destruction happening everywhere. Honestly, this is the point where you can clearly see where most of the budget went because the movie becomes huge visually. Some shots look genuinely impressive while others definitely feel overloaded with CGI, but at least the film never becomes visually dull. Everything stays colorful and energetic even during destruction scenes. The Shazam family splits up trying to control different situations around the city, and these scenes mostly work because the movie keeps jumping between characters instead of staying in one place too long. Darla is still probably the easiest character to like because she acts excited about almost everything, even dangerous situations. The actress keeps that playful energy natural enough that it never feels annoying. Then you have Eugene treating half the crisis like a giant fantasy game while Pedro mostly hangs back quietly trying to help wherever he can. Billy meanwhile is getting more frustrated because nobody fully listens to him anymore. He wants everyone to act like an organized superhero team, but the family still behaves like siblings first and heroes second. There are several moments where Billy tries giving instructions and everybody either interrupts him or ignores parts of the plan completely. The movie handles this conflict in a pretty grounded way honestly. Nobody suddenly becomes emotional or dramatic. It just feels like a tired older brother struggling to keep everybody together. Asher Angel keeps those quieter scenes believable because he never pushes the emotions too hard. Then when Billy changes into Shazam, Zachary Levi brings back the louder energy again. By this point in the movie you kind of adjust to the difference between their performances. Levi definitely plays the role more like an excited kid pretending to be an adult superhero, and sometimes it works better during comedic scenes than emotional ones. One sequence that actually stood out visually happens when the family tries stopping a group of mythical creatures moving through the city. The movie goes fully fantasy here. Harpies fly between buildings, civilians run through smoke-filled streets, and magical barriers start appearing around Philadelphia. The camera moves quickly during these scenes, but the action usually stays clear enough to follow. That honestly became one of the better things about David Sandberg's direction throughout the movie. Even when giant creatures and explosions fill the screen, the scenes rarely become confusing. The cinematography during nighttime scenes especially looks better than expected. A lot of superhero movies make dark scenes so dim that you can barely see what is happening, but here the lighting uses blues, golds, and purples in a way that keeps characters visible while still creating atmosphere. The magical effects also blend pretty nicely into the environments most of the time. There are definitely moments where the CGI creatures look too artificial, especially during wider shots, but close-up interactions usually hold together better. At the same time, Freddy is still dealing with Anthea after learning the truth about her identity. Their relationship honestly becomes more interesting after the reveal because now both characters feel uncomfortable around each other for different reasons. Freddy feels betrayed while Anthea clearly does not fully agree with what her sisters are doing. Rachel Zegler plays those conflicted moments pretty naturally. She does not suddenly turn overly emotional or evil after the reveal. Anthea still feels calm and unsure about where she belongs. There is a quieter scene between Freddy and Anthea that actually works really well because the movie slows down for a minute and lets the actors carry the moment without giant effects everywhere. Freddy jokes around at first because that is basically how he handles stress, but underneath it you can tell he genuinely feels hurt. Dylan Grazer is honestly one of the strongest performers in the movie because he makes Freddy feel like a real person instead of just comic relief. Meanwhile, the daughters of Atlas continue rebuilding their power using the magical staff. Hespera still feels more thoughtful and controlled while Calypso becomes increasingly aggressive. Helen Mirren gives Hespera this tired energy like somebody who has watched humanity repeat the same mistakes for centuries. Lucy Liu goes completely opposite. Every scene with Calypso feels tense because she acts like she is constantly close to losing patience with everyone around her. The movie also starts leaning harder into mythology around this point. The daughters talk more about the lost realm of the gods and how humanity stole powers that were never meant for them. Some of the exposition scenes probably go on a little too long, but the performances help keep them interesting enough. The production design during these scenes deserves credit too. The magical chambers, ancient textures, and glowing symbols everywhere make the fantasy side of the world feel much larger than it did in the first film. Christoph Beck's soundtrack becomes more noticeable during this middle section too. Instead of relying only on loud superhero music, the score mixes fantasy adventure themes with softer emotional moments. During action scenes, the music gets bigger without becoming non-stop noise, and during quieter conversations it pulls back enough to let the actors carry scenes naturally. One thing people talked about a lot after release was how crowded the superhero genre felt around 2023, and honestly you can kind of feel this movie trying hard to separate itself from the others. Instead of focusing heavily on multiverse ideas or darker realism, it goes all in on fantasy creatures, mythology, magical weapons, and family comedy. Sometimes that makes the movie feel refreshing, and other times it feels like too many ideas competing for attention at once. There is also a noticeable difference between how the movie handles comedy compared to many modern superhero films. The jokes here mostly come from characters acting naturally around each other instead of constant sarcastic one-liners during every action scene. Some jokes still miss, obviously, but the family interactions usually feel relaxed enough that the humor comes across more naturally. As Philadelphia falls deeper into chaos, giant magical barriers trap people inside parts of the city while creatures continue spreading destruction through the streets. Civilians start realizing this situation is completely different from normal superhero fights. The scale keeps growing, but the movie still keeps returning to Billy's fear about losing his family. Even while the city is falling apart, his biggest concern stays personal. He is terrified that the people he finally connected with are slowly drifting away from him. And honestly, that emotional thread probably keeps the movie together more than the giant action scenes do. By this point the movie is throwing a lot onto the screen at once, but surprisingly it still stays watchable because the story keeps moving through the characters instead of only focusing on destruction. Philadelphia is basically turning into a fantasy battlefield now. Huge magical barriers surround parts of the city, creatures are attacking civilians, and people have no idea what is even happening anymore. Some scenes honestly look like something out of a fantasy adventure movie instead of a superhero film. There is one sequence where the family is trying to rescue civilians while these harpy-like creatures fly between buildings, and visually it looks pretty good because the movie keeps enough color and lighting in the scene. A lot of superhero movies around that time had this gray washed-out look where everything blended together, but here the glowing magic, gold lightning, and nighttime city lights keep the screen visually alive. The effects are not perfect obviously. Some wider shots definitely look artificial, especially when large CGI creatures move too fast, but the movie at least tries making the action entertaining to watch. Billy is getting more stressed during all this because the family still feels disorganized. Every time he tries making a serious plan, somebody interrupts or starts arguing. The interesting thing is the movie never makes Billy fully right or fully wrong. He wants everybody to work together properly, but at the same time he is trying so hard to act responsible that he starts pushing people away without realizing it. Zachary Levi actually handles those frustrated scenes better than some of the comedy moments. When the character slows down and stops making jokes every few seconds, you can feel Billy's insecurity underneath everything. He genuinely thinks the family is eventually going to leave him behind, and that fear keeps affecting how he reacts to everyone. Back at the Rock of Eternity, Anthea secretly starts helping Freddy more openly. She already disagreed with parts of her sister's plan earlier, but now you can clearly see she is uncomfortable watching innocent people suffer. Rachel Zegler plays Anthea in a very calm way throughout the movie, and honestly that choice works because the character could have easily become overly dramatic. Instead she mostly looks conflicted and tired, like someone trapped between family loyalty and guilt. Freddy meanwhile still acts nervous even during serious moments, which honestly makes him more believable. Dylan Grazer keeps carrying emotional scenes naturally because he never suddenly changes Freddy into some ultra-serious hero. Even when he is scared or upset, he still talks like himself. That consistency helps the character feel real. The movie also spends more time with Hespera and Calypso arguing about what should happen next. This actually became one of the more interesting parts of the story for me because the sisters do not completely agree with each other. Hespera still feels somewhat reasonable underneath everything. She understands humans have built lives around these powers now, even if she believes the gods were wronged. Calypso on the other hand is completely consumed by anger at this point. Lucy Liu honestly looks like she is having fun playing Calypso. She brings a much sharper energy into scenes compared to Helen Mirren's calmer performance. Whenever both actresses share scenes together, the contrast keeps the dialogue from becoming flat exposition. You can feel the tension between the sisters growing naturally. The mythology side of the movie becomes even bigger once the daughters begin using the magical seed connected to the Tree of Life. This is where the film fully embraces fantasy logic. Giant roots begin spreading through the city while creatures start appearing from the underground. Some audience members probably checked out a little during these parts because the movie goes very heavy into magical lore and CGI spectacle, but honestly it also gives the film a different identity compared to most superhero movies released around that time. Visually the tree sequences look pretty impressive in certain shots. Massive glowing roots twist through streets and buildings while the city slowly transforms around them. The production design team clearly put effort into making the fantasy elements feel large and detailed. Combined with Christoph Beck's score, these moments almost feel closer to mythological adventure films than comic book action. The soundtrack deserves credit throughout this middle section because it knows when to step back. During emotional conversations, the music stays softer and more atmospheric instead of constantly trying to force emotion onto scenes. Then when action starts, the orchestral themes become bigger without turning into pure noise. A lot of modern blockbusters overload scenes with non-stop loud music, but this movie keeps better balance than expected. There is also a funny moment where the family argues about strategy while the city is literally collapsing around them. And honestly scenes like that capture why people liked the first movie. The family dynamic still feels natural. They interrupt each other, joke around during stressful situations, and sometimes completely fail at acting like professional heroes. Even when certain jokes miss, the chemistry between the actors keeps scenes moving smoothly. Around this point the public inside the movie also starts losing confidence in the heroes. Earlier people treated the Shazam family like celebrities, but now the destruction happening across Philadelphia is becoming impossible to ignore. News reports blame the heroes for bringing magical chaos into the city, and Billy takes those reactions personally because he already doubts himself constantly. One thing I noticed rewatching the movie is that David Sandberg seems much more comfortable directing character interactions than giant CGI battles. The quieter scenes often feel more natural and focused, while some action moments become overloaded with effects. Still, compared to many big superhero films from that period, the movie at least keeps its own personality. It feels colorful, weird, and unapologetically fantasy-driven. As the magical tree continues spreading through the city, Anthea finally decides to openly go against her sisters, and that decision starts pushing the story toward a much larger confrontation between the family and the daughters of Atlas.so. After spending most of the movie stuck between both sides, Anthea finally starts helping the Shazam family directly. And honestly, the story becomes smoother once that happens because now the characters actually have somebody who understands what the daughters of Atlas are planning. Up until this point, the family has mostly been reacting to chaos without fully understanding how dangerous things are becoming. Now they finally realize Calypso is not interested in simply restoring balance or taking powers back. She wants revenge against humanity itself, and by this stage she barely cares how much destruction happens along the way. Philadelphia is basically collapsing into fantasy madness now. Giant roots from the Tree of Life spread across streets and buildings while mythical creatures move through the city attacking everything around them. The movie goes completely all in on fantasy visuals here. Dragons, harpies, magical barriers, glowing weapons. Sometimes it honestly feels like the filmmakers just kept adding more ideas every 10 minutes. Surprisingly though, it still stays entertaining because the movie commits fully to the tone instead of trying to act grounded or realistic. There is one sequence where the family moves through the city while civilians are trapped between collapsing streets and giant roots twisting through buildings, and visually it is probably one of the strongest sections of the movie. The environments finally feel massive. Cars are buried under roots, smoke fills entire streets, emergency lights flash everywhere, and creatures fly across the skyline. The CGI definitely becomes overwhelming in some shots, but at least the scenes never look empty. The production actually feels expensive on screen. The action also stays easier to follow than a lot of superhero movies from that period. David Sandberg keeps the camera moving without constantly cutting every second. You can usually tell where characters are standing and what they are trying to do. That honestly helps more than people realize because many giant CGI movies become exhausting when viewers cannot understand the action geography. Billy meanwhile is starting to break under pressure a little. He wants to save the city, protect the family, and somehow keep everybody together emotionally at the same time. The problem is he still does not fully believe in himself. Even after becoming a superhero, Billy still thinks people are eventually going to leave him behind. That insecurity quietly controls most of his decisions. Asher Angel continues handling those emotional scenes in a grounded way. Then when Billy transforms, Zachary Levi brings back the louder personality again, though honestly by now the movie starts balancing Levi's energy a little better. He still jokes around, but there are more scenes where the character feels genuinely tired and stressed underneath everything. The family scenes continue carrying the movie emotionally. Darla still tries staying optimistic no matter how dangerous things get. Eugene treats every magical situation like he is inside some fantasy role-playing game, and Pedro slowly becomes more confident during the chaos. The actors genuinely feel comfortable together by this point. Conversations overlap naturally, people interrupt each other, and scenes rarely feel stiff. Anthea helping the family also gives Rachel Zegler more to do. Earlier her role mostly depended on mystery, but now she starts becoming emotionally involved in the conflict itself. She still cares about her sisters, especially Hespera, but she clearly cannot support Calypso anymore. Zegler keeps the performance restrained, which honestly works better than if the movie pushed huge emotional breakdowns every scene. Meanwhile Calypso becomes more unstable the more power she gains. Lucy Liu fully commits to the character's anger, and while some dialogue is a little over the top, she delivers it with enough confidence that the scenes still work. Calypso starts feeling less like a calm mythological figure and more like somebody completely consumed by revenge. Hespera remains more complicated. Helen Mirren gives the character a tired sadness underneath the villain role. Even when Hespera fights the heroes, it never fully feels like she enjoys hurting people. Mirren brings enough presence to the role that simple conversations remain interesting even without action happening around her. There is also a scene around here where Billy and Hespera talk more directly about power, responsibility, and family, and honestly these quieter moments help the movie a lot. Without them, the non-stop spectacle probably would have become exhausting. Sandberg seems much more interested in character interactions than pure destruction scenes, and those moments usually end up feeling stronger because the actors get room to breathe. The soundtrack keeps helping the atmosphere too. Christoph Beck mixes softer emotional themes with larger fantasy music whenever the creatures or magical elements appear. During scenes with the Tree of Life spreading through the city, the music becomes heavier and more mythological sounding rather than traditional superhero music. It gives the movie its own identity even when the plot becomes messy. One thing people talked about after release was whether the movie deserved its poor box office performance, and honestly watching it now, it feels more like bad timing than a completely terrible film. By 2023, audiences were already getting tired of non-stop superhero releases, and DC movies especially had a strange reputation because everybody knew the franchise was heading toward another reboot. That uncertainty definitely hurt excitement around the film. Still, the production quality itself is mostly solid. The costumes look good, the practical sets mixed with CGI environments blend better than expected, and the movie at least tries giving audiences something visually different. Instead of dark realism, it goes toward colorful fantasy chaos. As the city keeps falling apart, the family realizes Calypso's next move could destroy far more than Philadelphia if nobody stops her soon. The problem is the group is already exhausted, their powers are unstable, and Billy still has not figured out whether he is actually capable of leading them through something this big. Why now the movie is fully in chaos mode, but weirdly this is also where the emotional side of the story starts working better. The family is exhausted, the city looks completely destroyed in some areas, and even the heroes stop acting overly confident. Earlier in the film they still treated parts of superhero life like a game, but now everybody looks tired and overwhelmed. That shift actually helps the movie because the danger finally feels real without the tone becoming too dark. Philadelphia at this point barely looks like the same city from the beginning. Giant roots from the Tree of Life have spread through streets and buildings, mythical creatures are roaming around openly, and entire sections are trapped behind magical barriers. Visually, the movie keeps throwing huge fantasy images onto the screen. Sometimes it absolutely feels excessive, but honestly at least it does not look generic. So many superhero films around that time blended together visually, while this one actually has its own style with all the mythology and fantasy elements mixed into the modern city setting. There is a scene where the family moves through the ruined streets trying to rescue trapped civilians, and you can tell the production team really wanted the environments to feel large and chaotic. Smoke covers parts of the city, emergency vehicles are abandoned everywhere, giant roots twist around skyscrapers, and creatures fly overhead while people run through the streets confused. The effects are not flawless obviously. A few shots look too digital, especially during wide aerial views, but the practical destruction mixed with CGI works well enough that the city still feels lived in. Billy is carrying most of the pressure now because everybody keeps looking toward him for decisions, even when they argue with him constantly. What the movie does pretty well here is showing that Billy does not suddenly become some perfect confident leader. He still hesitates. He still second-guesses himself. Even while trying to save the city, part of his mind stays focused on the fear of losing the family. Zachary Levi honestly works better in these more serious moments than people sometimes admit. When the script lets him calm down a little, you can actually feel Billy's stress underneath all the jokes and superhero posing. Then whenever the movie cuts back to Asher Angel in his normal form, The emotional side feels even more grounded because Angel naturally plays Billy with more restraint. Meanwhile, Anthea is fully separated from her sisters now, though emotionally it still clearly affects her. Rachel Zegler keeps playing the role quietly. She never turns Anthea into some giant emotional speech machine. Most of the conflict shows through smaller reactions and expressions instead, which honestly feels more believable. Freddie stays close to her during these scenes, and their relationship continues being one of the more natural parts of the film. Freddie still jokes around constantly because that is basically how he deals with fear, but there are moments where you can tell he genuinely cares about her beyond the awkward flirting from earlier. Jack Dylan Grazer keeps making Freddie feel human even when the movie becomes overloaded with fantasy chaos around him. At the same time, Calypso is becoming more dangerous the more power she gains from the Tree of Life. Lucy Liu fully commits to the character's anger. Every scene with Calypso now feels tense because she acts completely consumed by revenge and frustration. She barely even listens to anyone anymore, including Hespera. Hespera herself slowly starts questioning everything more openly. Helen Mirren gives the character this constant feeling of exhaustion, like somebody who is tired of destruction even while helping cause it. The movie honestly becomes more interesting whenever Hespera and Billy interact because both characters are dealing with similar fears in different ways. Billy is terrified of losing his family while Hespera already lost hers long ago. There is a conversation between them that actually lands pretty well because the movie finally slows down after so much non-stop action. No giant explosions, no creatures flying everywhere, just two characters talking while the city collapses around them. Sandberg handles scenes like this much better than pure CGI spectacle. He lets the actors carry the emotion naturally instead of forcing dramatic music and huge speeches into every moment. Speaking of music, Christoph Beck's score becomes heavier during this section of the movie. The fantasy themes connected to the Daughters of Atlas sound larger now, almost like mythological war music instead of normal superhero themes. But the soundtrack also knows when to quiet down. During emotional scenes, the music pulls back enough that conversations still feel natural. The family dynamic still keeps the movie entertaining even during darker moments. Darla continues trying to stay positive no matter how bad things become. Eugene keeps treating magical problems like puzzles from a video game. Pedro slowly starts stepping forward more confidently during action scenes instead of hiding in the background. These smaller character moments help balance the giant scale of the story. One thing I noticed rewatching the film is that it actually looks better than some much more expensive superhero movies from that period. The lighting stays colorful, costumes remain clear on screen, and the action rarely turns into muddy gray visuals. The movie definitely has CGI-heavy moments that look unfinished, but overall the production still feels polished enough. The problem was probably timing more than anything else. By the time this released, audiences already seemed exhausted by non-stop superhero projects. The DC universe itself also felt messy because everybody knew major changes were coming behind the scenes. So even though the movie has flaws, it almost felt like people had already decided not to care before it even came out. As Calypso's power keeps growing, the Tree of Life starts becoming unstable, and now the danger is no longer limited to the city itself. Billy and the family realize that if they cannot stop her soon, the destruction could spread far beyond Philadelphia, and for the first time Billy starts understanding that saving everyone might require a sacrifice he is not ready to think about. At this stage the movie starts moving toward the final confrontation. But honestly it does a decent job slowing down in between the action so the story does not become pure noise. The city is already falling apart, the family is exhausted, and even the villains are starting to lose control of the situation they created. The Tree of Life keeps spreading through Philadelphia, creating more creatures and destruction every minute, and nobody fully knows how far the damage could go if it keeps growing. One thing the movie keeps doing well visually is showing the scale of the disaster without making the city feel empty. There are constantly civilians running through streets, emergency workers trying to help people, and creatures appearing in random parts of the city. A lot of superhero movies forget normal people completely once the action gets bigger, but here the chaos actually feels like it is affecting everyone around the heroes. There is a sequence where the Shazam family splits up again to hold back creatures while Billy and Anthea try figuring out how to stop the Tree of Life itself. The action during these scenes is pretty large, but the movie still keeps enough personality through the characters that it never turns into completely mindless destruction. Darla is still trying to encourage everyone even while monsters are literally attacking the city. Eugene keeps acting weirdly excited every time some new magical creature appears. Pedro by this point is much more confident compared to the beginning of the movie, and you can tell the character has quietly grown more comfortable with himself. The family chemistry honestly carries a lot of these scenes. The actors really do feel like siblings who have spent years together. They interrupt each other naturally, argue over stupid things during serious situations, and joke around in ways that sound spontaneous instead of scripted. Without that chemistry, the movie probably would have collapsed under all the CGI spectacle. Billy, meanwhile, is finally starting to realize he cannot control everything. Earlier he kept trying to act like the responsible leader who could hold the family together forever, but now the situation has become too big for that. Zachary Levi actually gives some of his better scenes around this point because the character stops trying so hard to be funny all the time. The humor is still there, but now it feels more like Billy covering fear rather than the movie constantly chasing jokes. Then when the movie cuts back to Asher Angel in the quieter moments, the emotional side lands better because Angel always keeps Billy feeling grounded. You can see how badly Billy wants to protect the family even while slowly accepting that he might not be able to save everyone and himself at the same time. Anthea continues helping the family more openly now, and honestly Rachel Zegler fits into the group pretty naturally by this point. Earlier her character felt separated because of the mystery surrounding her, but now she feels more relaxed around Freddie and the others. There are small moments where she starts smiling more or joking slightly, and those little changes make the character feel more human. Freddie and Anthea's scenes still work mostly because Dylan Grazer keeps Freddie believable. Even during emotional conversations he still talks awkwardly and nervously instead of suddenly sounding like some dramatic movie hero. Grazer understands the character well enough that Freddie always feels like an actual teenager stuck inside this insane magical situation. At the same time Calypso becomes more unstable than ever. Lucy Liu fully leans into the anger and obsession now. Calypso stops caring about balance or restoring anything. She just wants power and revenge at this point. There is a scene where she argues with Hespera, and honestly you can feel the relationship between the sisters completely falling apart. Hespera still sees some limit to what should happen, but Calypso has already crossed that line mentally. Helen Mirren keeps Hespera interesting because she never feels like a simple villain. Even while helping create destruction, there is regret in the way she speaks and reacts. The movie becomes stronger whenever it focuses on these character tensions instead of non-stop action because the actors actually bring weight to the scenes. Visually the fantasy elements get even bigger now. The dragon connected to Calypso finally appears more fully, and honestly this is where the CGI becomes a little inconsistent. Some close-up shots of the creature look pretty detailed, especially around the scales and glowing eyes, but wider flying shots sometimes look too artificial. Still, the movie commits fully to the fantasy style, so even when effects look messy, the scenes stay entertaining because they are at least imaginative. The cinematography during these sequences still deserves credit. The movie uses a lot of gold, purple, and blue lighting around the magical effects, which helps separate characters from the dark city backgrounds. A lot of recent superhero movies had action scenes where everything blended together visually, but here you can usually tell what is happening. Christoph Beck's soundtrack also becomes much larger during this section. The music finally starts sounding closer to a full fantasy war movie. Choir vocals, heavier orchestral themes, deeper drums. But the soundtrack still knows when to disappear during emotional scenes instead of constantly trying to overpower conversations. One thing I actually appreciated re-watching the movie is that it never becomes cynical. Even when the plot gets ridiculous with dragons and magical trees destroying cities, the story still stays sincere about the family relationships. The movie genuinely cares about Billy's fear of losing people, Freddie wanting connection, and the family trying to stay together. As the Tree of Life becomes more unstable, Hespera finally realizes Calypso has gone too far, and that decision slowly pushes her toward helping Billy instead of fighting him. Billy starts understanding there may only be one way to stop the destruction completely, but he still avoids saying it out loud because once he admits it, the possibility of sacrificing himself becomes real. So now the movie is basically heading straight into the final battle, but before all the huge action fully starts, there are actually a few quieter moments that help the ending feel more emotional. The family is tired, the city is a disaster, and even the characters themselves look like they know things might not end cleanly. Earlier in the film everybody still acted like they could somehow joke their way through the situation, but now there is this constant pressure hanging over everything. The Tree of Life keeps growing through Philadelphia, and visually the city almost stops looking real at this point. Streets are covered with massive glowing roots, creatures are moving around openly, and parts of the skyline are completely damaged. The production team clearly wanted the environment to feel like mythology crashing directly into the modern world. Honestly, some of the visuals look really good here. The combination of practical debris, lighting effects, smoke, and CGI creatures gives certain shots a much bigger scale than the movie's box office numbers would make people expect. At the same time, there are definitely moments where the CGI struggles a little, especially during wide aerial shots with multiple creatures flying around at once. But compared to a lot of superhero movies from that period, the action still stays visually readable. David Sandberg never lets the screen become total chaos where you cannot understand what characters are doing. Billy starts piecing together what has to happen in order to stop Calypso and destroy the unstable power connected to the Tree of Life. The problem is the plan puts him directly at the center of the danger. You can tell he already knows there is a strong chance he might not survive, but he avoids openly talking about it because he does not want the family stopping him. Zachary Levi honestly gives some of his strongest scenes around this part of the movie because the character finally feels more emotionally focused. The exaggerated comedy gets toned down, and Billy starts sounding more sincere. Levi works much better when the movie lets him play the character with genuine vulnerability instead of non-stop loud humor. Then the quieter scenes with Asher Angel continue grounding everything emotionally. Angel always plays Billy like somebody carrying anxiety underneath the surface, and that performance becomes more important now because the story is finally forcing Billy to think beyond simply protecting himself emotionally. Meanwhile, Hespera fully turns against Calypso after realizing how dangerous her sister has become. The relationship between the sisters honestly ends up being more interesting than expected because neither actress plays the roles in an exaggerated comic book style. Helen Mirren keeps Hespera calm even during emotional scenes, which makes the character feel more believable. You get the sense that Hespera is exhausted by centuries of conflict and revenge. Lucy Liu meanwhile goes completely in the opposite direction with Calypso. By now the character feels consumed by anger. Every scene with her has this unstable energy because it feels like she could destroy something at any second. Liu commits fully to that intensity, and even though some dialogue becomes very fantasy-heavy, her performance keeps the scenes entertaining. There is a conversation between Billy and Hespera that actually works surprisingly well because both characters understand sacrifice in different ways. Billy is terrified of losing his family while Hespera already knows what it feels like to lose everything connected to her old world. The movie slows down enough here to let the actors carry the moment naturally. No giant explosions, no forced emotional music pushing the audience to cry, just two characters talking honestly while chaos continues around them. Christoph Beck's score during these scenes stays quieter and more emotional compared to the huge fantasy music used during battles. The soundtrack honestly does a pretty good job throughout the movie of knowing when to pull back. Some superhero films drown every conversation under dramatic music, but this one usually gives actors enough space. Back with the family, everybody slowly realizes Billy is hiding something from them. Darla especially notices it first because she has always been emotionally closest to him. These scenes are simple, but they help remind you why the foster family dynamic became the heart of these movies in the first place. Even with all the dragons, magic staffs, and giant creatures, the emotional core still comes back to this group wanting to stay together. Freddy also gets some nice moments here. Dylan Grazer continues carrying scenes naturally because he never suddenly changes Freddy into some fearless action hero. Even during final battle preparation scenes, Freddy still sounds nervous and awkward. That consistency honestly helps the character feel real. Anthea remains caught emotionally between helping the family and watching her sisters fall apart completely. Rachel Zegler plays those scenes quietly instead of dramatically, and it works better that way. You can see guilt in her reactions without the movie stopping for giant speeches explaining every feeling. Visually, the final setup scenes look pretty strong. The lighting becomes darker while gold magical energy from the staff and the tree glows across the city. The dragon scenes especially give the movie a fantasy adventure feeling that separates it from more grounded superhero films. Sandberg clearly wanted this climax to feel mythological instead of purely comic book action. One thing that honestly stands out rewatching the movie is how sincere it stays. Even when parts of the story get messy or overloaded with CGI, the film never feels embarrassed about caring emotionally for its characters. Billy's fear of losing his family remains central all the way through the story. As Calypso prepares to unleash even more destruction using the dragon and the unstable powers of the Tree of Life, Billy quietly makes peace with the possibility that stopping her may cost him everything. So once the final battle properly starts, the movie basically throws every fantasy element it has onto the screen at the same time. Dragons flying through the city, magical lightning everywhere, giant creatures attacking civilians, collapsing buildings, glowing roots spreading across streets. It honestly becomes massive in scale, but surprisingly it still stays easier to follow than a lot of superhero finales because the action usually stays centered around the characters instead of random destruction. Calypso fully loses control at this point. She rides the dragon through Philadelphia while using the staff's power to spread more chaos from the Tree of Life. Lucy Liu completely commits to the role during these scenes. She plays Calypso with so much anger and frustration that the character almost feels dangerous even before the action starts. Some of the dialogue gets very fantasy-heavy, but Liu's energy carries the scenes anyway because she never looks unsure of what kind of movie she is in. Visually, the dragon scenes are probably some of the most ambitious parts of the film. There are moments where the creature actually looks pretty impressive, especially during closer shots when the lighting reflects off the scales and fire moves through the smoke around the city. Some wider flying shots definitely look more artificial, but honestly the movie keeps moving fast enough that it rarely becomes distracting for too long. Billy finally decides to confront Calypso directly while the rest of the family focuses on protecting civilians and stopping the creatures spreading through the city. One thing the movie does well here is giving everybody something to do instead of turning the final battle into only Billy fighting alone. Darla helps evacuate people trapped by the destruction, Pedro starts becoming much more aggressive during combat, and Eugene uses his powers more creatively than earlier in the movie. The family interactions still keep scenes grounded even while everything around them becomes ridiculous fantasy chaos. There is a moment where they are literally fighting monsters while still arguing like siblings, and honestly that balance between humor and tension is what keeps the movie entertaining even when the plot gets messy. Zachary Levi gives a much more controlled performance during the climax compared to earlier parts of the film. Billy still jokes occasionally, but now the character finally feels fully focused. The movie stops treating him like a confused kid pretending to be a hero and starts letting him actually act like one. At the same time, Asher Angel continues carrying the emotional side of Billy in quieter scenes between the action. The combination between Angel's more grounded performance and Levi's larger superhero energy works better during the ending because both versions of the character are finally moving emotionally in the same direction. Hespera also becomes more important during the final battle. Helen Mirren gives the character enough regret and exhaustion that her decision to help Billy feels believable instead of random. Hespera realizes Calypso is no longer trying to restore balance or save their world. She is just consumed by destruction now. There is a sequence where Billy and Hespera work together briefly against Calypso, and honestly those scenes are stronger than some of the bigger CGI moments because both actors bring calm emotional weight into the middle of all the chaos. The movie slows down just enough during these interactions to remind you that the story is still about people and relationships underneath the giant fantasy spectacle. The cinematography during the climax actually looks pretty good for a CGI-heavy superhero movie. The lighting stays colorful and clear instead of becoming dark gray visual noise. Gold lightning, purple magical energy, fire from the dragon, glowing roots across the city. Even when the screen gets crowded, the visuals remain distinct enough that scenes still look alive. David Sandberg also deserves credit for keeping the action readable. A lot of modern blockbusters cut every second during final battles until viewers cannot tell what is happening anymore. Here you can usually understand where characters are moving and what the immediate danger is. That helps the climax feel more exciting instead of exhausting. Christoph Beck's soundtrack becomes huge during these scenes. Choir vocals, orchestral music, heavy drums. The score fully leans into fantasy adventure territory instead of typical comic book music. But even during the biggest action moments, the soundtrack still leaves room for emotional beats instead of overpowering every scene. One emotional moment that actually lands pretty well happens when Billy realizes the only way to stop the Tree of Life completely is by trapping the energy inside the magical dome surrounding the city and destroying it from within. The problem is somebody has to stay inside long enough to make sure Calypso cannot escape. The movie does not turn this realization into some giant dramatic speech. Billy mostly keeps it to himself at first because he already knows how the family would react if he openly admitted what he plans to do. That choice honestly fits the character better. Billy has spent the entire movie terrified of losing his family, and now he is quietly preparing to give himself up to save them. Back with Freddie and Anthea, their relationship also gets a few emotional moments during the chaos. Jack Dylan Grazer and Rachel Zegler continue having believable chemistry together because neither performance becomes overly dramatic. Freddie still sounds nervous even during serious conversations, and Anthea still feels emotionally restrained. As the battle grows more destructive, Calypso completely loses control of the dragon and the magical energy surrounding the city. Buildings begin collapsing faster, creatures spread everywhere, and Billy finally accepts that there may not be another way to stop the destruction without sacrificing himself inside the dome. So by this point the movie is fully locked into the emotional side of the ending. The action is still huge and chaotic, but underneath all the dragons and magical destruction, the story becomes much more personal again. Billy already knows what he has to do, and the tension now comes from watching him slowly accept it while trying not to let the family notice. The city around them looks completely destroyed in certain areas. Giant roots from the Tree of Life have ripped through buildings, smoke fills the streets, emergency sirens are going non-stop, and creatures are still moving through Philadelphia while civilians try escaping however they can. Visually the movie definitely goes over the top, but honestly that scale helps the climax feel important. The production team clearly wanted the finale to feel like a full fantasy apocalypse happening inside a superhero world. There are some shots during this section that honestly look really strong. Billy flying through the burning city while magical lightning flashes across the sky has a much larger cinematic feeling than people probably expected from this movie. The lighting especially helps. Gold energy from Shazam's powers mixed with the darker purple tones around Calypso and the Tree of Life gives the action a clear visual contrast. At the same time, some CGI still looks inconsistent. A few wide shots with the dragon flying above the city definitely look more artificial than the closer scenes. But the movie moves quickly enough and keeps enough visual energy on screen that the weaker effects usually pass fast before becoming distracting. Calypso is completely out of control now. Lucy Liu plays the character almost like someone who has stopped thinking rationally. The anger fully consumes her by this stage. Even when things start collapsing around her, she refuses to back down. Lou honestly deserves credit because she commits fully to the role the entire movie. She never plays Calypso with irony or self-awareness. That seriousness helps the fantasy elements feel more believable. Meanwhile, Hespera finally accepts that Billy's plan might be the only way to stop everything. Helen Mirren keeps giving the character this quiet sadness that works really well during the ending. Hespera understands sacrifice better than almost anyone else in the story, so her scenes with Billy carry more emotional weight than expected. There is a moment between them that actually lands surprisingly well because the movie slows down completely for a minute. No giant explosions, no music trying too hard to force emotion, just two characters understanding what is about to happen. David Sandberg honestly handles scenes like this better than some of the giant action moments. He trusts the actors enough to carry emotion naturally without over-directing everything. Billy finally traps Calypso inside the dome surrounding the city while the rest of the family desperately tries reaching him. The emotional side of these scenes works mainly because the movie spent enough time building the foster family dynamic earlier. If the family chemistry had not worked, this entire ending probably would have felt empty. Darla especially becomes emotional once she realizes Billy is staying behind on purpose. Her reaction feels believable because throughout both movies she always seemed closest to him emotionally. The family scenes during the climax avoid becoming overly dramatic though. Nobody suddenly gives giant speeches. Most of the emotion comes through panic, confusion, and people trying desperately to stop Billy before it is too late. Zachary Levi probably gives his best performance in the film during this final stretch because the comedy finally disappears almost completely. Billy feels calm for the first time in the movie. Earlier he constantly acted nervous, hyperactive, or insecure, but now the character finally accepts responsibility without trying to hide behind jokes. Then when the movie briefly cuts back to Asher Angel, the emotional impact becomes even stronger because Angel always played Billy with this quiet fear underneath the surface. Seeing that character willingly stay behind after spending the entire movie afraid of losing his family actually gives the ending a solid emotional payoff. The final confrontation between Billy and Calypso gets visually massive. Lightning explodes across the dome, the dragon crashes through parts of the city, magical energy tears through the sky, and the Tree of Life starts becoming unstable. Christoph Beck's soundtrack goes full fantasy epic during these scenes. Heavy orchestral music, choir vocals, deep drums. The score becomes huge without completely drowning the action. One thing I appreciated during the climax is that the action remains visually understandable. Even with everything exploding at once, you can still follow what Billy is trying to do. Sandberg keeps the camera focused enough that the audience never completely loses track of the characters inside the chaos. Then comes the moment where Billy finally destroys the staff's power, creating a massive explosion inside the dome. The entire sequence is shot with bright gold lightning and magical energy filling the screen while the city watches from outside the barrier. It is definitely dramatic, but the movie earns it enough emotionally that the scene works. After the explosion, the dome disappears and the destruction across the city slowly stops. The creatures vanish, the roots stop spreading, and for the first time in a long while everything becomes quiet. That silence honestly helps the emotional impact more than loud music or dramatic speeches would have. The family rushes into the ruined area searching for Billy, and the tone during these scenes becomes much calmer compared to the non-stop chaos before. Smoke still covers parts of the city, debris is everywhere, and the heroes themselves look exhausted. When they finally find Billy's body, the reactions feel surprisingly restrained in a good way. The movie does not overplay the sadness. It mostly lets the family's expressions and silence carry the moment naturally. And honestly, after all the giant fantasy chaos throughout the movie, that quieter emotional approach works much better for the ending. So after all the explosions and giant fantasy chaos finally stop, the movie slows down a lot, and honestly that was probably the right choice because the audience needs a minute to breathe after how massive the climax became. The city is damaged everywhere, smoke still hangs in the air, emergency vehicles move through the streets, and the magical destruction finally starts disappearing piece by piece. The atmosphere suddenly feels much quieter compared to the non-stop action from before. The family finding Billy's body is honestly one of the more emotional moments in the movie because nobody reacts in some exaggerated dramatic way. They mostly just look shocked and exhausted. That restraint actually helps the scene feel more real. Darla immediately breaks down because she always had the closest emotional connection with Billy, while Freddie looks completely lost standing there. Even Eugene and Pedro, who usually stay calmer emotionally, look like they genuinely do not know what to do. Dylan Grazer especially sells the moment well because Freddie stops joking entirely for once. Throughout the whole movie he constantly uses humor to deal with fear or awkwardness, so seeing him suddenly quiet makes the scene hit harder naturally. The movie also avoids dragging the sadness too long. It understands the emotional point already landed, so instead of turning the next 20 minutes into non-stop grieving scenes, it lets the characters process things more quietly while the story keeps moving. Visually, the aftermath scenes look surprisingly good too. The destroyed city still feels large in scale, but the lighting becomes softer and calmer now that the magical chaos is over. There are some nice shots of damaged streets and broken buildings while civilians slowly start returning outside. Sandberg honestly handles these quieter visual moments better than some directors who only focus on spectacle. Meanwhile, Hespera is dying after everything that happened during the battle. Helen Mirren gives the character a peaceful feeling during these final scenes instead of turning her death into some giant villain redemption moment. Hespera understands the destruction finally ended, and there is almost relief in the way Mirren plays her. Then comes one of the more unexpected scenes in the movie when Wonder Woman suddenly appears. Gal Gadot returning here honestly got a strong reaction in theaters because audiences were not fully expecting the cameo after the earlier fake headless Wonder Woman joke the movie kept using. The scene itself is simple. Wonder Woman uses her connection to the gods to restore Billy with the wizard staff's remaining power. Some people thought the moment felt a little too convenient, and honestly that criticism is understandable because Billy's death does not last very long. But at the same time, the emotional payoff still works because the story was always more focused on Billy finally choosing sacrifice rather than permanently killing him off. When Billy wakes up again, the family reactions honestly feel genuine. Nobody suddenly delivers giant emotional speeches. They mostly just look relieved and overwhelmed. The chemistry between the cast really carries these scenes because by now they feel believable as a family unit instead of actors standing together for plot reasons. Zachary Levi also handles the lighter emotional scenes better than the earlier comedy-heavy parts of the film. Once the movie stops pushing constant jokes, Levi becomes much easier to connect with emotionally. Then the brief moments with Asher Angel again remind you how much quieter and more grounded Billy always feels underneath the superhero version. The movie then starts wrapping up the larger storylines. Anthea is basically left alone after losing her sisters, but instead of making her disappear at the end, the film allows her to stay connected with Freddie and the family. Rachel Zegler keeps the character emotionally restrained all the way through the ending, which honestly works because Anthea never stops feeling slightly separate from the human world around her. Freddie and Anthea's final scenes together are pretty simple, but they work because the relationship never became overly dramatic in the first place. Freddie still acts awkward, Anthea still feels quieter and uncertain, and that consistency makes the ending feel natural. The movie also quietly resolves Billy's biggest emotional problem. Earlier he was terrified of losing the family once everybody grew older and moved on. But after everything that happened, he finally understands that being a family is not something that disappears just because people change or grow up. The film never stops for a giant speech explaining that message directly though. It mostly shows it through the way Billy interacts with everyone afterward. One thing I honestly appreciated by the end is that the movie stayed sincere the entire time. Even when the CGI became messy or the plot got overloaded with mythology and creatures, the story itself never felt cynical. It genuinely cared about the foster family relationships, and that emotional core kept the movie watchable even during weaker sections. Christoph Beck's soundtrack also calms down nicely during the resolution scenes. The huge fantasy battle music disappears, and softer emotional themes return instead. The score knows not to overplay the emotion too much, which helps the quieter ending land better. Financially, the movie unfortunately never found a huge audience despite all the effort clearly visible on screen. Reports placed the production budget well above $100 million before marketing costs, and while the film did earn money worldwide, it underperformed compared to expectations. A lot of that honestly came down to timing. By 2023, superhero fatigue was becoming very real, and DC projects especially struggled because audiences already knew major franchise changes were coming. Still, rewatching the movie now, it honestly feels more entertaining than its box office reputation suggests. It has flaws, obviously. Some CGI looks unfinished, the pacing occasionally becomes crowded, and the tonal balance sometimes struggles between comedy and mythology. But the family dynamic, colorful fantasy visuals, and sincere emotional core keep it enjoyable. And before the movie fully ends, it still has a few small surprises left during the post-credit scenes. So after the main story wraps up, the movie moves into the post-credit scenes, and honestly this was one of the moments where you could really feel the strange situation DC movies were in around 2023. Audiences were still expecting future connections and universe building, but at the same time everybody already knew the franchise was going through major changes behind the scenes. Because of that, even the post-credit scenes had this weird feeling where people were excited in theaters but also unsure if any of it would actually continue later. The first post-credit scene brings back Amelia Harcourt and John Economos from the Suicide Squad and Peacemaker. Jennifer Holland and Steve Agee play the scene in a very casual way, almost like office workers trying to recruit a superhero who barely understands what they are talking about. Billy gets invited to join a larger superhero organization, and the whole conversation leans back into the lighter comedy style from earlier in the movie. Honestly, the scene itself is funny mainly because of Zachary Levi's delivery. Zachary Levi works best when the humor feels conversational instead of overly forced, and here the awkwardness lands naturally. The joke about the Justice Society and Justice League confusion actually got good audience reactions in theaters because it felt like characters casually talking instead of the movie desperately trying to create memes. The second post-credit scene brings back Dr. Savannah and Mr. Mind from the first film. Mark Strong returns as Savannah, still trapped and frustrated while Mr. Mind continues talking endlessly about future plans without ever getting to the point. This scene honestly felt more like the filmmakers joking about how long it was taking to continue that storyline rather than seriously setting up the next movie. One thing that becomes clearer after finishing the film is how much the cast chemistry carries everything. The plot itself honestly gets messy at times with all the mythology, magical creatures, gods, dragons, staffs, barriers, and fantasy lore stacked on top of each other. But the reason the movie stays enjoyable is because the Foster family still feels believable together. The performances are probably more important than people gave them credit for during release. Jack Dylan Grazer consistently keeps Freddy entertaining without making him annoying, which honestly could have happened very easily with this kind of character. Grazer understands how to make awkward humor feel natural instead of scripted. Rachel Zegler also fits surprisingly well into the movie's tone. Anthea could have ended up feeling like a generic magical love interest, but Zegler keeps the character emotionally grounded and calm enough that she stands out more quietly instead of demanding attention every scene. Then you have Helen Mirren and Lucy Liu, who honestly elevate the villains just through performance alone. The script does not always give them incredibly deep material, but both actresses commit fully to the fantasy world. Helen Mirren especially brings real weight to Hespera because she plays the role with sadness and exhaustion rather than cartoon villain energy. Lucy Liu meanwhile fully embraces Calypso's anger and intensity. Even when some dialogue becomes very mythology-heavy, Liu's confidence keeps the scenes entertaining. The contrast between both sisters also helps because they never feel emotionally identical. Visually, the movie honestly deserved more appreciation than it got at release. Yes, some CGI shots absolutely look unfinished, especially during wider action scenes involving creatures and dragons. But compared to many superhero films released around the same period, this movie actually has personality visually. The fantasy designs stand out, the costumes remain colorful, and the environments feel textured instead of looking like empty gray digital backgrounds. David Sandberg's direction also keeps things more visually understandable than a lot of giant blockbusters now. Even during the biggest action scenes, you can usually follow where characters are, what danger exists, and how the fights are progressing. That clarity honestly matters a lot more than people realize. The cinematography throughout the movie also helps maintain its fantasy atmosphere. Gold lightning effects, purple magical energy, glowing roots spreading through dark streets, ancient chambers inside the Rock of Eternity. Even when the plot becomes overloaded, the visual style keeps the movie feeling distinct. Christoph Beck's soundtrack deserves mention too because the score quietly does a lot of work holding the tone together. The music shifts smoothly between family comedy, emotional scenes, mythology, and giant fantasy battles without feeling completely disconnected. During action scenes the soundtrack becomes huge and orchestral, but during smaller emotional moments it pulls back enough that conversations still feel natural. Production-wise, the movie clearly had a large budget behind it. Reports around release placed the production cost somewhere around $125 million before marketing expenses, and the scale definitely shows on screen. Between the creature effects, city destruction, practical costumes, fantasy environments, and large action sequences, the film rarely feels small. Unfortunately, the box office did not match that scale. The movie underperformed commercially and became part of the larger discussion around superhero fatigue in 2023. Audiences had started getting overwhelmed by non-stop comic book releases, and DC's uncertain future also hurt excitement. A lot of viewers assumed the storylines might never continue anyway because of the upcoming reboot plans. Still, audience reactions were actually more mixed than completely negative. Some people really enjoyed the family dynamic, lighter tone, and fantasy adventure feeling, while others thought the movie tried juggling too many ideas at once. Rewatching it now, it honestly feels like a film that suffered more from bad timing than total failure. Because underneath all the dragons, mythology, and giant CGI battles, the movie still understands its real strength is the foster family at the center of everything. That emotional core keeps the story feeling human even when the fantasy elements become ridiculous. And honestly, that sincerity is probably why the movie remains more enjoyable than many people expected after hearing all the criticism around it. Looking back at the whole movie after it ends, one thing that honestly stands out is how different its energy feels compared to a lot of other superhero films released around the same period. Around 2023, many comic book movies were leaning heavily into darker tones, multiverse stories, or non-stop references to larger cinematic universes. Shazam! Fury of the Gods instead goes in a completely different direction. It feels more like a fantasy family adventure that just happens to include superheroes. That choice probably helped the movie stand out for some viewers while also pushing others away. If somebody wanted a more serious grounded comic book film, this movie probably felt too silly and chaotic. But if you watch it more like a modern fantasy adventure with superhero elements mixed in, a lot of the tone actually makes more sense. The family dynamic remains the biggest reason the movie works emotionally. Even when the story gets overloaded with magical lore, dragons, ancient gods, and giant destruction scenes, the emotional focus always comes back to Billy and the foster family. That part never really disappears underneath the spectacle. Billy's storyline throughout the movie is honestly simpler than the mythology around him, but it works because it feels personal. He spends most of the film terrified that the family he finally found is eventually going to disappear. Since Billy spent so much of his childhood without stability, he clings tightly to the people around him once he finally feels connected somewhere. The movie does a pretty good job showing that fear without constantly explaining it through dramatic speeches. Asher Angel handles that emotional side naturally because he always keeps Billy quieter and more thoughtful. Then Zachary Levi brings the louder superhero energy on top of that. The contrast between their performances still feels uneven sometimes, but during the emotional scenes near the end, both versions of Billy finally start feeling emotionally connected in a way they did not earlier in the film. Freddy's storyline also ends up carrying a surprising amount of the movie emotionally. Dylan Grazer gives probably the most consistently natural performance in the film. Freddy never feels like a typical comic relief character because Grazer keeps the awkwardness believable. Even when the script gives him exaggerated jokes or nervous reactions, it still sounds like a real teenager trying to survive insane situations. The relationship between Freddy and Anthea also works better than expected because the movie keeps it small and personal instead of turning it into giant dramatic romance scenes. Rachel Zegler plays Anthea very calmly the entire movie. She never tries overpowering scenes emotionally, which actually helps the character feel more believable inside such a chaotic fantasy story. Then there are the villains, who honestly became more interesting mostly because of the casting. Helen Mirren and Lucy Liu bring enough presence to the movie that scenes involving mythology and exposition still stay engaging. Helen Mirren especially gives Hesper emotional weight beyond just being an angry villain. She plays the character like someone exhausted after centuries of disappointment and loss. Lucy Liu meanwhile fully commits to Calypso's anger. She brings sharp aggressive energy into almost every scene, and even when the movie gets messy, Calypso still feels dangerous because Liu never underplays the character's intensity. Visually, the movie honestly deserved more credit than it received during release. The CGI definitely has weak spots, especially during some creature shots and wider flying scenes, but the overall visual identity feels much stronger than many modern superhero films. The movie actually uses color confidently. Gold lightning, glowing purple magic, fantasy creatures, ancient chambers, giant roots twisting through cities. Even if some effects look unfinished, the film still feels visually alive. The Rock of Eternity remains one of the coolest locations in the movie too. The production design team clearly expanded the environment compared to the first film. Large staircases, glowing symbols, hidden magical chambers, giant statues. It genuinely feels like an ancient fantasy location instead of just another CGI room. David Sandberg's direction throughout the movie honestly works best during character interactions rather than giant action scenes. Whenever the film slows down and lets actors talk naturally, the pacing improves immediately. The action scenes are still entertaining, but the quieter moments between Billy, Freddy, Anthea, or Hespera usually leave a stronger impression emotionally. At the same time, Sandberg still handles visual clarity much better than many blockbuster directors. Even during the largest battles, viewers can normally understand where characters are and what is happening. That may sound basic, but a lot of superhero films fail badly at that now. The soundtrack by Christoph Beck also quietly helps the movie more than people probably noticed. The score moves smoothly between comedy, emotional family moments, fantasy mythology, and giant action scenes without feeling disconnected. During scenes involving the Daughters of Atlas, the music leans more into mythological fantasy instead of standard superhero themes, which helps separate the movie from other comic book films. One issue the movie definitely struggles with though is pacing. The middle section especially sometimes feels overloaded with ideas. Mythology, magical staffs, dragons, barriers around the city, the Tree of Life, family drama, Freddy and Anthea's relationship. There are moments where the story feels like it is juggling too much at once. Some scenes probably needed more breathing room while others could have been shortened. Still, the movie's sincerity honestly carries it through weaker moments. It never feels cynical or embarrassed by its fantasy elements. The film fully commits to giant dragons, magical gods, and emotional family themes without trying to constantly mock itself. That genuine tone probably helped the movie connect with audiences who were tired of superhero films acting overly sarcastic all the time. And honestly, even with all its flaws, The movie still feels more memorable than many bigger superhero releases from the same era because at least it has its own personality. One thing that became interesting after the movie left theaters was how many people started saying it worked better at home than they expected. During its theatrical release, the conversation around it got buried under superhero fatigue discussions, DC reboot news, and comparisons to bigger comic book films. But once people watched it later without all that noise around it, a lot of viewers realized the movie is honestly more entertaining than its reputation suggested. A big reason for that is probably the tone. The movie never tries acting more important than it really is. It knows it is a fantasy adventure about a foster family with magical powers fighting ancient gods and dragons. Instead of forcing darker realism into the story, it fully leans into colorful fantasy chaos. That sincerity honestly makes the film easier to enjoy because it feels like the filmmakers genuinely wanted audiences to have fun instead of constantly setting up future franchise plans. The action scenes especially become easier to appreciate on rewatch because David Sandberg actually puts effort into visual clarity. A lot of superhero movies from the last few years started blending together visually because the action became non-stop shaky CGI chaos. Here, even when giant creatures are flying through Philadelphia and magical lightning is exploding everywhere, you can still understand where characters are and what is happening. There is also a noticeable effort to make every family member useful during action scenes instead of only focusing on Billy. Darla uses her speed powers constantly to help civilians, Eugene becomes more creative with his abilities, Pedro slowly grows into his role physically and emotionally, and Freddy continues balancing humor with actual emotional stakes. Those details help the action feel connected to the characters instead of just random destruction. The comedy balance is another thing that works better than some people admitted during release. The movie definitely has jokes that miss, and sometimes Zachary Levi pushes the exaggerated superhero energy too hard, but most of the humor comes naturally from the family interacting with each other. The siblings interrupt each other, argue during stressful moments, and joke around the same way real family members often do when situations become uncomfortable. Dylan Grazer probably handles this balance best out of the whole cast. Freddy is funny almost constantly, but Grazer never plays him like a cartoon character. Even when the script gives him awkward jokes or nervous reactions, he still sounds like an actual teenager trying to process insane situations around him. Then there is Billy, who honestly becomes more interesting on rewatch once you focus less on the comedy and more on the insecurity underneath everything. Asher Angel quietly sets up Billy's emotional state from the beginning. He is scared of losing the family, scared of growing up, and scared of not being needed anymore. Then Zachary Levi plays the superhero version almost like Billy, trying too hard to hide those fears behind excitement and jokes. The performances from the villains also hold up pretty well. Helen Mirren gives Hespera more emotional depth than the script probably required. She never fully plays the character like a pure villain. Even during confrontations with the heroes, Hespera feels tired more than evil. You get the sense she genuinely believes the gods were wronged but no longer enjoys the destruction happening around her. Lucy Liu goes completely opposite with Calypso. Lucy Liu fully embraces the anger and intensity of the character. Some scenes honestly become entertaining just because of how committed she is to the role. Calypso never feels emotionally restrained the way Hespera does. She feels dangerous because she acts like someone constantly close to exploding emotionally. Rachel Zegler also fits surprisingly naturally into the movie. Rachel Zegler keeps Anthea grounded and emotionally quiet, which balances the louder personalities around her. The relationship with Freddy works because neither actor tries making it overly dramatic. Their scenes feel awkward and relaxed in a believable way. Visually, the movie honestly has more personality than many comic book films with much larger box office success. The fantasy elements stand out clearly. The dragon designs, glowing magical effects, giant roots from the Tree of Life spreading through the city, the ancient look of the Rock of Eternity. Even when the CGI looks rough in places, the movie still feels visually creative instead of generic. The cinematography also deserves some credit because the lighting stays colorful throughout the film. Modern blockbusters sometimes become so dark visually that action scenes lose impact completely, but here the gold lightning, blue magic, purple energy, and fire effects constantly keep the screen visually active. Christoph Beck's soundtrack also quietly carries the movie emotionally more than people probably noticed. The score shifts naturally between fantasy adventure music, emotional family scenes, and larger battle themes. During mythology scenes involving the daughters of Atlas, the music almost feels like something from an older fantasy epic instead of a modern superhero movie. Of course, the film still has problems. The pacing in the middle section definitely gets crowded with too many fantasy concepts arriving at once. The movie sometimes jumps quickly between mythology exposition, family comedy, romance, and giant action scenes without enough breathing room. Certain CGI shots also clearly look unfinished, especially during some wide aerial battles. But honestly, compared to a lot of superhero movies that audiences completely forget after a few weeks, this one at least sticks in your memory. The foster family dynamic gives the story emotional warmth, the fantasy visuals make it feel different from standard comic book films, and the movie stays sincere all the way through instead of drowning everything in sarcasm. That sincerity is probably why a lot of viewers started appreciating the movie more after the initial release drama faded away. One thing that really affected how people viewed Shazam. Fury of the Gods had nothing to do with the movie itself. It was the situation happening around DC at the time. By 2023, audiences already knew the studio was planning major changes to the entire franchise, and that uncertainty honestly hurt excitement before the film even released. A lot of viewers went into theaters already thinking these characters might never appear again in the same universe, so the movie lost some of the long-term investment superhero audiences usually have. That feeling becomes even more noticeable when you watch the post-credit scenes now. The movie clearly tries setting up future connections and bigger possibilities, but at the time people were already questioning whether any of those plans would matter later. It created this strange atmosphere around the release where even positive reactions got buried under constant discussion about reboots and studio decisions. And honestly, that is unfortunate because the film itself clearly had effort behind it. You can see the production scale on screen constantly. The costumes are detailed, the fantasy environments look ambitious, and the action sequences involve much larger destruction and creature work than the first movie. Reports around release placed the budget somewhere above $100 million before marketing, and visually the movie mostly looks like that money actually went onto the screen. The Rock of Eternity alone looks massively expanded compared to the first film. The set design feels richer with giant statues, glowing magical symbols, staircases stretching into darkness, hidden chambers, and ancient textures everywhere. Instead of feeling like a generic CGI room, the location actually has atmosphere now. It genuinely feels like an ancient magical space connected to gods and mythology. The same goes for the fantasy elements spread across Philadelphia later in the movie. The giant roots from the Tree of Life twisting through streets and buildings give the city a very different visual identity from most superhero destruction scenes. Instead of another alien invasion or skybeam situation, the movie leans fully into fantasy mythology. Dragons flying above the skyline, magical barriers trapping sections of the city, creatures running through smoke-filled streets. Even when the CGI becomes inconsistent, the visual imagination itself still stands out. Director David F. Sandberg honestly seems much more interested in fantasy adventure storytelling than the darker realistic style some superhero films chase now. You can feel his horror background occasionally too, especially during scenes involving creatures or darker lighting. Certain moments with the Daughters of Atlas actually carry a slightly eerie atmosphere underneath the comedy. At the same time, Sandberg never loses focus on the family dynamic. No matter how huge the action becomes, the story always circles back to Billy and the foster family emotionally. That balance is probably why the movie still works even when the plot itself becomes overcrowded with mythology and magical lore. The casting honestly deserves a lot of credit for that. Dylan Grazer continues being one of the strongest parts of the movie because Freddy always feels believable. Grazer understands how to make awkwardness funny without making the character irritating. Even during emotional scenes, Freddy still behaves like himself instead of suddenly transforming into a completely different serious hero. Rachel Zegler also fits naturally into the story. Anthea could have easily become forgettable surrounded by so many larger personalities and fantasy elements, but Zegler keeps the performance emotionally grounded. Her scenes with Freddy work because they feel relaxed instead of forced into giant dramatic romance moments. Then there are the villains, who honestly become memorable mostly because of the actresses playing them. Helen Mirren brings real emotional weight to Hespera. The character never feels purely evil. Mirren plays her with sadness and exhaustion, like someone who has spent centuries carrying disappointment. That performance gives the mythology scenes more depth than they might have had otherwise. Lucy Liu meanwhile fully embraces Calypso's rage. Lucy Liu makes the character feel genuinely dangerous because she acts like somebody completely consumed by anger and revenge. The contrast between Mirren's calmer energy and Liu's intensity keeps scenes involving the sisters interesting throughout the movie. One thing people debated heavily after release was Zachary Levi's performance as Shazam. Some audiences loved the exaggerated enthusiasm while others felt it clashed too much with Asher Angel's quieter version of Billy. Watching the movie carefully, you can honestly see both sides. Levi definitely plays the superhero form much younger and louder than Angel plays Billy normally. But during the emotional scenes later in the movie, the performances finally start aligning more naturally because both versions of Billy are emotionally focused on the same fear of losing family. The soundtrack by Christoph Beck also quietly helps connect the movie's different tones together. The score shifts between fantasy mythology, family comedy, emotional scenes, and giant action without feeling completely disconnected. During scenes involving the Daughters of Atlas, the music leans heavily into orchestral fantasy themes rather than standard superhero music, which helps the movie maintain its unique identity. Financially though, none of that was enough to save the film commercially. The movie underperformed at the box office despite the large production scale and recognizable DC branding. Superhero fatigue had become a real issue by then, and audiences were becoming much more selective about which comic book movies they actually went to theaters for. Still, rewatching the film now honestly makes its reception feel harsher than necessary. It absolutely has flaws. The pacing becomes messy in the middle, some CGI looks unfinished, and the mythology occasionally gets overloaded with exposition. But compared to many superhero movies that feel manufactured purely for franchise setup, this film at least feels like it has personality and genuine affection for its characters. And honestly, that warmth is probably the reason a lot of viewers ended up enjoying it more than they expected once they actually sat down and watched it without all the internet negativity surrounding the release. When you really look at why some people connected with Shazam, Fury of the Gods more than others, it honestly comes down to whether the emotional family side worked for them. Because underneath all the mythology, dragons, giant creatures, magical staffs, and city destruction, the movie is actually pretty simple emotionally. It is mostly about Billy being terrified of losing the first real family he ever had. That fear drives almost everything he does during the story. He acts controlling because he is scared everybody will drift away from him. He keeps trying to sound responsible because he thinks being needed is the only thing keeping the family together. Even his constant awkward energy as Shazam starts making more sense when you view it as Billy trying to convince himself that everything is still fun and under control. Asher Angel quietly carries that emotional side throughout the film. Angel rarely overacts scenes. Most of Billy's anxiety shows through small reactions, pauses, or frustration during conversations. Then Zachary Levi plays the superhero version much louder and more expressive, which definitely divided audiences, but by the ending you can see what the movie was trying to do emotionally. Billy spends the entire story afraid of losing people, and then in the climax he willingly sacrifices himself for them anyway. That emotional arc honestly works because the movie never stops returning to the family connection underneath all the spectacle. And the family dynamic itself still feels stronger than many superhero teams in bigger franchises. Darla, Freddy, Eugene, Pedro, Mary. They all actually feel like siblings with different personalities instead of characters written to fill specific archetypes only. They interrupt each other naturally, tease each other constantly, and react differently to stressful situations in believable ways. Dylan Grazer especially gives the movie a lot of personality through Freddy. The character could have easily become exhausting because he jokes so much, but Grazer always keeps him human underneath the humor. Freddy talks like somebody trying to hide insecurity behind excitement, which makes him surprisingly relatable even during ridiculous fantasy situations. The relationship between Freddy and Anthea also fits naturally into the story because it stays small and awkward instead of becoming overly dramatic. Rachel Zegler keeps Anthea emotionally restrained almost the entire movie, and honestly that calmness balances Freddy's nervous energy really well. One thing that honestly helps the film stand out compared to many modern superhero movies is that it fully commits to fantasy. A lot of comic book films recently started blending together visually because they all chase similar styles. Here the movie goes completely into mythology. Ancient gods, magical creatures, giant dragons, glowing staffs, living trees spreading across cities. Even when the CGI looks rough in some scenes, the visual imagination still gives the movie personality. The cinematography also supports that fantasy atmosphere pretty consistently. The use of glowing gold lightning, purple magical energy, dark blue nighttime lighting, and fire effects keep scenes visually active. David Sandberg clearly wanted the movie to feel colorful and mythological instead of grounded realism. And honestly that choice probably helped the movie age better than some people expected. Rewatching it now, the film at least feels visually distinct. It may not always look perfect technically, but it rarely looks bland. The action scenes themselves also benefit from Sandberg's approach to clarity. Even during giant battles involving dragons and magical destruction, viewers can usually tell where characters are and what the immediate danger is. That sounds simple, but so many modern blockbusters fail at basic visual storytelling during action. At the same time, Sandberg honestly seems more comfortable directing quieter emotional scenes than giant spectacle. Some of the best moments in the movie are simple conversations between Billy and Hespera, Freddy and Anthea, or the family arguing inside the Rock of Eternity. Those scenes feel natural because the actors are allowed room to breathe without constant effects or forced comedy interrupting every second. The villains themselves also ended up more memorable than many expected because of the casting choices. Helen Mirren gives Hespera emotional depth through restraint. She never acts like a stereotypical comic book villain screaming about destruction constantly. Instead, Hespera feels tired, disappointed, and emotionally worn down by centuries of loss. Then Lucy Liu takes Calypso in the complete opposite direction. Lucy Liu fully commits to the anger and intensity of the character. Even when the movie becomes chaotic, Calypso still feels threatening because Liu plays her with complete confidence. Christoph Beck's soundtrack honestly deserves more appreciation too. The score does a lot of work connecting the movie's different tones together. Family comedy, emotional scenes, mythology, giant battles. The music shifts between all of them smoothly without making the movie feel completely disconnected. One reason the film probably struggled critically is because it arrived during a period when audiences were becoming much harsher towards superhero movies overall. By 2023 people were tired of endless franchise setup, multiverse storylines, and CGI overload. So even though this movie actually tries focusing on character relationships more than universe building, it still got caught in that larger frustration surrounding the genre. Financially, the movie obviously disappointed compared to expectations. The production budget reportedly sat somewhere around $125 million or higher before marketing, and the box office returns never fully matched that scale. But honestly, if this exact movie had released several years earlier during the peak superhero craze, the audience reaction probably would have looked very different. Because at the end of the day, the movie's biggest strength is not the dragons or giant battles. It is the warmth between the characters. Even when the story becomes messy, the family at the center keeps the movie feeling human. And honestly, that emotional sincerity is something a lot of modern superhero movies have started losing, when comparing Shazam. Fury of the Gods to the first Shazam, the biggest difference honestly comes from scale. The first movie felt much smaller and more personal. It focused heavily on Billy learning what family actually means while slowly discovering his powers. The humor felt more grounded because the story itself stayed relatively simple. A foster kid suddenly becomes a superhero and has to figure out how to balance both sides of his life. The sequel goes much bigger almost immediately. Ancient gods, magical creatures, dragons, giant city destruction, fantasy mythology. Everything becomes larger visually and narratively. For some viewers that made the sequel more exciting, while others missed the smaller emotional focus of the first film. And honestly, both opinions make sense. The first movie probably feels tighter overall because it has a cleaner emotional storyline. Billy starts alone and emotionally closed off, then slowly learns to trust the foster family around him. The sequel already begins with the family together, so the emotional conflict becomes more about Billy being afraid of losing what he already has. That fear actually gives the sequel more emotional maturity in some ways. Billy is no longer scared of being alone because he already knows what connection feels like now. Instead, he becomes terrified that growing up will eventually pull everyone apart. That is honestly a pretty relatable fear, especially for somebody who spent most of childhood without stability. Asher Angel quietly handles that emotional insecurity really well throughout the movie. Angel's version of Billy constantly feels like somebody overthinking everything underneath the surface. Then Zachary Levi plays the superhero side with much louder energy, which again became one of the most debated things about the film. Watching both movies back to back, you can definitely notice the performance gap more clearly. Levi plays Shazam almost like Billy emotionally freezes at a younger age whenever he transforms. Sometimes that approach works perfectly during comedic scenes, while other times it feels disconnected from Angel's more grounded performance. Still, during the emotional scenes later in the sequel, especially once Billy starts accepting responsibility and sacrifice, the performances begin aligning much better emotionally. That is probably why the ending works more effectively than some people expected earlier in the movie. The sequel also expands the foster family more compared to the first film. Darla, Eugene, Pedro, and Mary all get more moments individually, even if some characters still receive more attention than others. Freddie obviously remains the standout after Billy because Dylan Grazer brings so much natural personality into the role. Freddie honestly becomes the emotional glue of the movie in many scenes. He keeps the story entertaining whenever the mythology gets too heavy, but he also carries emotional moments surprisingly well because Grazer never stops making the character feel vulnerable underneath the humor. Rachel Zegler's addition as Anthea also gives the sequel a softer emotional storyline running underneath the giant fantasy plot. Rachel Zegler keeps Anthea emotionally restrained throughout the movie, which helps her scenes feel calmer compared to the louder personalities around her. The villains themselves are also much more visually ambitious than Dr. Savannah from the first film. Helen Mirren and Lucy Liu bring real presence to the Daughters of Atlas, especially because they approach the roles so differently. Hespera feels emotionally exhausted while Calypso feels consumed entirely by anger. Visually, the sequel definitely looks bigger than the first film too. The Rock of Eternity receives far more detail, the action sequences involve larger destruction, and the fantasy creature designs push the movie much further into mythological adventure territory. The cinematography also becomes more stylized. Gold lightning, glowing purple magic, giant roots spreading across dark city streets, dragon fire lighting entire skylines. Even when the CGI becomes inconsistent, the movie at least has a strong visual identity. One thing the sequel honestly does better than many superhero movies is maintaining visual color. Around this period, a lot of comic book films looked overly dark or gray during action scenes. Here the fantasy effects constantly keep the screen visually active. The lighting choices help separate magical elements clearly from the city environments around them. Christoph Beck's soundtrack also expands naturally from the first film. The sequel's score feels much larger and more mythological, especially during scenes involving the Daughters of Atlas and the Tree of Life. The music leans heavily into fantasy adventure tones instead of purely superhero themes. At the same time, the sequel definitely struggles more with pacing. The first film flowed more smoothly because the story stayed simpler. Here there are moments where the mythology, family drama, romance, comedy, and giant action scenes all compete for attention at once. The middle section especially sometimes feels overloaded with ideas. But honestly, even with those flaws, the movie still leaves a stronger emotional impression than many superhero films people instantly forget after watching. The reason is simple. The foster family relationship feels genuine. No matter how ridiculous the fantasy elements become, the emotional core stays sincere. That sincerity honestly becomes the movie's biggest strength by the end. It never feels embarrassed about caring emotionally for the characters. Billy's fear of losing his family, Freddy wanting connection, Anthea struggling between worlds, Hespera carrying centuries of disappointment. The film treats those emotions seriously even while giant dragons are flying through Philadelphia. And maybe that is why the movie slowly gained more appreciation from some viewers after release. Once people stopped expecting it to become some massive universe-changing DC event and just watched it as a fantasy family adventure, the strengths became much easier to see. So after sitting with the movie for a while, the thing that honestly stays in your mind the most is not the giant dragon scenes or the huge city destruction. It is the family energy. That is really what separates Shazam! Fury of the Gods from a lot of other superhero movies released around the same time. By 2023, the genre had started feeling very repetitive for a lot of audiences. Bigger universes, darker stories, endless multiverse setups, giant CGI battles that all blended together. This movie still has giant CGI battles obviously, but underneath all that it keeps returning to smaller emotional moments between characters who actually feel connected to each other. The foster family dynamic honestly carries almost every part of the film. Even scenes that should feel silly on paper usually work because the actors interact naturally together. They talk over each other, interrupt conversations, joke around at bad times, and react differently to stressful situations. It feels less like a polished superhero team and more like actual siblings accidentally trapped inside a fantasy war. Dylan Grazer probably understands that tone better than anyone else in the cast. Freddy constantly balances humor with vulnerability in a way that never feels forced. The character could have easily become exhausting because he talks so much, but Grazer keeps him relatable underneath the jokes. Then there is Billy, who honestly becomes more emotionally interesting the more you think about the movie afterward. His biggest fear is not dying or losing powers. It is being abandoned again. Everything he does throughout the story comes back to that fear. Asher Angel quietly builds that emotional insecurity through the entire movie. Billy always feels tense underneath the surface, even during happier moments. Then Zachary Levi turns the superhero side into somebody trying almost too hard to stay upbeat and energetic. The performances do not always match perfectly, but emotionally the movie still makes Billy's arc work by the end. The sacrifice scene especially lands because the story spends so much time showing Billy's fear of losing the family. Earlier in the movie he tries controlling everyone because he is terrified they will drift apart naturally. Then during the climax he finally accepts that real family means caring about people even when you cannot hold on to them forever. That emotional payoff honestly gives the movie more heart than many superhero films with bigger box office numbers. The villains also help the movie more than expected. Helen Mirren brings real emotional weariness to Hespera. She never feels like a typical screaming comic book villain obsessed only with destruction. There is sadness underneath the character the entire time, like somebody carrying centuries of disappointment. Lucy Liu meanwhile goes fully intense with Calypso. Lucy Liu plays the role with complete commitment. Even when the movie gets chaotic or overloaded with fantasy mythology, Calypso still feels threatening because Liu never treats the character like a joke. Rachel Zegler also fits naturally into the emotional tone of the film. Rachel Zegler keeps Anthea emotionally restrained, which balances the louder personalities around her. Her scenes with Freddie stay simple and awkward in a believable way instead of becoming dramatic fantasy romance scenes. Visually, the movie definitely has flaws, but it also has much more personality than people sometimes admit. The fantasy side of the world actually looks imaginative. The Rock of Eternity feels ancient and magical, the Tree of Life spreading through Philadelphia creates memorable visuals, and the glowing magical effects give the action scenes a strong visual identity. The CGI is inconsistent sometimes, especially during larger aerial battles or creature shots, but honestly that problem exists in many modern blockbusters now. What helps this movie stand out is that the fantasy imagery itself feels creative enough that the weaker effects do not completely ruin the experience. David Sandberg's direction also deserves credit for maintaining visual clarity during action scenes. A lot of recent superhero movies became exhausting because viewers could barely understand what was happening during battles. Here the geography of scenes usually stays readable. You know where characters are, what danger exists, and what the immediate goal is. The quieter scenes honestly remain stronger though. Billy talking with Hespera, Freddie and Anthea together, the family arguing inside the Rock of Eternity. Sandberg seems much more comfortable directing conversations and emotional interactions than non-stop CGI spectacle. Christoph Beck's soundtrack also helps hold the movie together tonally. The music shifts naturally between emotional family scenes, fantasy mythology, and giant battles without making the movie feel disconnected. During scenes involving the Daughters of Atlas, the score almost feels like something from an older fantasy adventure movie instead of standard superhero music. Financially, the film obviously disappointed compared to expectations. The box office numbers never matched the production scale, and the movie became another example people used while discussing superhero fatigue around that period. But honestly, timing probably hurt the movie as much as anything else. Audiences already seemed exhausted by constant franchise storytelling, and DC's uncertain future made many viewers emotionally disconnect from the universe before the movie even released. Still, the interesting thing is how many people slowly warmed up to the film later. Once expectations settled down and viewers watched it simply as a fantasy family adventure instead of some major DC event, the strengths became easier to appreciate. Because at the end of the day, the movie's biggest achievement is that it actually feels sincere. It cares about its characters, it commits fully to its fantasy world, and it never hides behind non-stop sarcasm or cynical humor. And honestly, that kind of emotional sincerity feels surprisingly rare in modern superhero movies now, when people look back at superhero movies from the early 2020s, Shazam. Fury of the Gods probably will not be remembered as one of the biggest or most important releases from that era. It did not dominate the box office, it did not completely change the genre, and it arrived during a period where audiences were already becoming exhausted by non-stop comic book content. But honestly, the movie still has qualities that make it more memorable than many larger superhero films people barely talk about anymore. A big part of that comes from identity. The movie actually feels like it knows what it wants to be. It is not trying to become a dark political story, a giant multiverse event, or some overly serious cinematic masterpiece. It is basically a fantasy adventure about a foster family dealing with gods, dragons, and magical chaos while trying to stay emotionally connected to each other. That clear identity honestly helps the film a lot because even when the pacing struggles or the CGI becomes inconsistent, the tone itself usually stays recognizable. The movie commits fully to fantasy mythology without constantly apologizing for how weird the concept is. The emotional core also remains surprisingly grounded underneath everything. Billy's story throughout both movies honestly works because it stays very human despite all the superhero elements surrounding it. He starts as somebody emotionally closed off because of abandonment and instability, then slowly learns to trust people, and finally reaches a point where he is willing to sacrifice himself for the family he spent so long being afraid to lose. Asher Angel quietly carries a lot of that emotional weight through smaller scenes. Angel's version of Billy always feels emotionally tense underneath the surface. Then Zachary Levi brings the louder superhero personality layered on top of those insecurities. Again, the contrast between the performances definitely feels uneven sometimes, but by the ending the emotional direction finally lines up well enough that Billy's sacrifice actually lands emotionally. The audience understands why that decision matters to him personally. Freddy also remains one of the most effective characters in the movie because Dylan Grazer gives the role so much natural energy. Freddy jokes constantly, but he never feels emotionally fake underneath the humor. Grazer keeps reminding viewers that Freddy is still just a teenager trying to process impossible situations while also wanting connection and acceptance. Rachel Zegler's Anthea also quietly becomes important emotionally because she represents somebody caught between worlds the same way Billy once was emotionally. Rachel Zegler plays the role with restraint, which helps balance the louder energy coming from the rest of the cast. Then there are the villains, who honestly work mostly because of the actresses involved. Helen Mirren gives Hespera emotional complexity that the script alone probably would not have created. She plays the character with exhaustion instead of pure cruelty, which makes scenes between Hespera and Billy surprisingly strong. Lucy Liu meanwhile completely embraces Calypso's intensity. Lucy Liu makes the character feel emotionally unstable and dangerous even when the movie gets overloaded with mythology exposition. Visually, the movie also deserves more respect than it received during release. Yes, the CGI becomes rough during some large action scenes, especially involving creatures or wide aerial shots. But visually the film still has creativity and personality. The Tree of Life spreading across Philadelphia creates memorable imagery, the Rock of Eternity feels atmospheric and ancient, and the use of glowing magical effects gives the movie a strong fantasy identity. The cinematography supports that style too. Gold lightning, purple magical energy, dragon fire reflecting across city buildings, glowing roots twisting through dark streets. Even when certain shots look unfinished technically, the visual imagination still keeps the movie engaging. David Sandberg's direction honestly feels strongest whenever the film slows down for emotional conversations. The family scenes, Billy speaking with Hespera, Freddy and Anthea together. Those moments usually feel more memorable than the giant spectacle because the actors are given room to act naturally. At the same time, Sandberg still handles action more clearly than many blockbuster directors working today. Even during huge battle scenes the geography remains understandable. That visual clarity matters more than people realize because so many modern action movies fail at basic readability. Christoph Beck's score also quietly shapes the movie's atmosphere throughout. The soundtrack moves smoothly between emotional family scenes and large fantasy battles without becoming overwhelming. During scenes involving mythology and the Daughters of Atlas, the music almost feels closer to classic fantasy adventure films than modern superhero soundtracks. The movie's biggest weakness honestly remains pacing. The middle section becomes overloaded with mythology, exposition, creature attacks, family drama, comedy, romance, and giant action sequences all happening close together. Certain ideas needed more breathing room while others probably could have been simplified. Still, even with those flaws, the film remains much more emotionally sincere than many superhero movies released around the same time. It genuinely cares about family, belonging, sacrifice, and emotional connection. It does not constantly undercut serious moments with cynical humor or treat its fantasy world like a joke. And maybe that sincerity is exactly why some audiences slowly started appreciating the movie more after release. Once expectations about universe building and franchise plans disappeared, viewers could just experience the film for what it actually is. A colorful fantasy superhero adventure with a surprisingly emotional heart underneath all the chaos. So after everything the movie throws at the audience, all the mythology, dragons, magical creatures, giant battles, emotional family scenes, and fantasy chaos, the lasting feeling from Shazam. Fury of the Gods honestly comes down to warmth more than spectacle. That is probably the best way to describe why the movie still works despite its flaws. Because the film absolutely has flaws. The pacing in the middle becomes overcrowded at times. Some CGI shots clearly needed more polish. Certain mythology explanations feel rushed while other scenes probably go on slightly too long. The tonal balance occasionally struggles between comedy and emotional drama. And the difference between Zachary Levi and Asher Angel playing Billy still feels uneven in places. But even with all of that, the movie still leaves behind more emotional connection than many technically cleaner superhero films. A lot of modern comic book movies started becoming obsessed with universe building, endless setup, darker realism, or non-stop sarcastic humor. This movie honestly feels refreshingly simple underneath the fantasy scale. It is about a kid terrified of losing the only real family he has ever known. That emotional idea keeps the story grounded no matter how ridiculous the fantasy elements become. Billy spends almost the entire movie trying too hard to hold everybody together because deep down he believes people eventually leave. That fear affects the way he acts as a brother, as a leader, and even as a superhero. Then by the end he finally understands that caring about people sometimes means letting go of the fear of losing them. And honestly, that emotional payoff works. The foster family dynamic remains the strongest thing in both movies. Darla, Freddie, Eugene, Pedro, Mary. They genuinely feel connected in a way many superhero teams honestly do not. The conversations feel messy and natural. People interrupt each other, argue over small things during dangerous situations, and react differently to stress in believable ways. Dylan Grazer especially carries huge parts of the movie emotionally through Freddie. He balances awkward comedy and genuine vulnerability so naturally that Freddie never feels like just comic relief. Even during the craziest fantasy scenes, Grazer keeps the character emotionally believable. Rachel Zegler also fits smoothly into the movie's emotional tone. Rachel Zegler plays Anthea with restraint, which helps balance the louder energy surrounding her. Her scenes with Freddie stay simple and personal instead of becoming exaggerated fantasy romance moments. The villains also ended up stronger than many people expected, mainly because of the casting. Helen Mirren gives Hespera emotional depth through exhaustion and sadness rather than cartoon villain energy. Then Lucy Liu pushes Calypso fully into anger and obsession. The contrast between both performances keeps the mythology scenes engaging throughout the movie. Visually, the film honestly deserves more appreciation too. Yes, some CGI becomes rough during larger creature shots and aerial sequences, but the movie still has imagination. The tree of life spreading through Philadelphia, dragons flying above the skyline, glowing magical roots twisting through dark streets, the ancient atmosphere of the Rock of Eternity. Even when effects are inconsistent, the fantasy identity stays memorable. Director David F. Sandberg clearly wanted the movie to feel colorful and mythological instead of grounded realism. That choice helps the film stand apart from many superhero projects that started blending together visually around that time. Sandberg also keeps action scenes more readable than many blockbuster directors working today. Even during giant battles involving magical creatures and explosions, viewers can usually understand where characters are and what is happening. That visual clarity honestly helps the movie a lot. At the same time, his quieter scenes are probably stronger than the spectacle. Billy talking with Hespera, Freddie and Anthea together, the family arguing inside the Rock of Eternity. Those moments feel more natural because the actors get space to simply interact without non-stop CGI overwhelming every second. Christoph Beck's soundtrack also quietly shapes the movie's identity. The music shifts smoothly between fantasy adventure themes, emotional family moments, mythology, and action without making the tone feel disconnected. During scenes involving the Daughters of Atlas, the score sounds much closer to a classic fantasy film than a standard superhero movie. Financially, the movie obviously disappointed. The box office numbers never matched the production scale, and the release happened during a period where superhero fatigue was becoming impossible to ignore. DC's uncertain future also hurt audience investment before the film even arrived. But honestly, the movie feels like one of those films that benefits from distance. Watching it now without all the release drama surrounding it makes the strengths much easier to notice. It is not trying to reinvent superhero storytelling. It is simply trying to tell a fantasy family adventure with sincerity. And that sincerity honestly matters. Because even when the plot gets messy, the movie never feels cynical. It cares about its characters, it commits fully to its fantasy world, and it treats emotional moments seriously without constantly hiding behind sarcasm. That is probably why a lot of people who gave the movie a second chance ended up enjoying it more than expected. It may not be one of the biggest superhero movies ever made, but it still has personality, heart, memorable visuals, strong family chemistry, and enough emotional honesty to stand out from many larger comic book films that audiences completely forgot a few weeks later. And honestly, in a genre filled with movies trying so hard to feel massive and important, there is something surprisingly enjoyable about a film that simply wants to tell a heartfelt fantasy story about family, fear, and belonging while dragons destroy a city in the background. Alright guys, that was Shazam. Fury of the Gods. Honestly, this is one of those movies that feels a lot better once you watch it without all the internet noise around it. It definitely has flaws, the pacing gets messy sometimes, some CGI shots look unfinished, and the story tries handling a lot at once, but at the same time the movie still has heart, strong family chemistry, fun fantasy visuals, and a surprisingly emotional core underneath all the chaos. It may not be the biggest superhero movie out there, but it still manages to feel more sincere than a lot of comic book films that came out around the same time. The foster family dynamic, Billy's emotional journey, Freddy's scenes, the mythology, the fantasy adventure feel, all of that gives the movie its own identity. So if you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. Did you enjoy the movie more than people expected, or do you think it deserved the criticism it got after release? And also let me know which movie you want next because there are still a lot of interesting films left to break down. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.